Right, you are going to make some templates for your beanie hat. To do this you're going to need a pencil, some paper, a ruler and these instructions. Now if you have a look at this beanie hat here, which the Queen is modelling for us in the corner, you will be able to see that there are different features on it. So features are things like the ears and the eyes and the nose, and we need to just work out some things about the features before we go on to make our template. So if we look at the ears, features like ears and horns, they attach to the top of the head, and you put those in as you're making the hat, and they have to be a double layer of fabric. That's because if you just had a single layer of fabric, they would just be too floppy. They need to stand up, so we have a double layer of fabric. Things like maybe hair, minion hair, things like that, you can still put those in as you're making, but they don't need to be stiff and stand up, so you can just have a single layer of fabric. But the important thing is ears, horns, those sort of features, they need to be a double layer of fabric so that they're a bit stiffer, they have a bit better shape. Now other things like the patches on this panda and the nose, you actually sew those on at the end, so you put those on when the rest of the hat has been made. So they're just single layer of fabric. They don't need to be a double layer of fabric. You're putting them on top of the hat and you're sewing them on at the end. Now for double features, for things like ears, horns, the things that you're putting in while you're making the hat, there is a kind of special way that you make those templates. You have to remember to add a seam allowance. So imagine that this is an ear template, and you have this ear, and this is the actual size that you want the ear to be. Now what you're going to do is you draw that, so you draw that on a piece of paper, you draw it the size that you want it to be eventually. So there we are, we've drawn that on the paper. Now there's a few things that you need to remember. If you make tiny weeny small features, they're very, very hard to sew on the sewing machine. So I would recommend for something like this ear, you mustn't make it less than 8 centimeters wide, final size, and I wouldn't make it less than 6 centimeters high, final size, okay? So the first thing you need to do is draw the feature at the size you finally want it to be on a piece of paper. Now we're going to look at what happens actually when you sew it. So, well, firstly, we never make the final size of the feature less than 6 centimeters. It's too fiddly to sew on the sewing machine if you do this, okay? So I can't reiterate that too strongly. Don't make tiny weeny little features. Now we're going to look at actually what happens when you sew. So your sewing line, if you've drawn your feature, you will sew 1 centimetre in from the edge, and we've learnt that that's called a seam allowance. So that's what you will sew in from the edge, and that 1 centimetre gap is the seam allowance. Now if you just do your template the size that you finally want your feature to be, and then you sew 1 centimetre all the way around the inside, it will make your final feature too small. It's going to be 1 centimetre too small all the way round when you turn it in the right way. Okay, so we need to think about this when we actually do our template. Okay, so here we go. Here is your drawing that you've done, and that's the size you want it to be. Now what you then have to do is you have to draw round that an extra centimetre all the way round. So you draw an extra centimetre all the way round. And this means when you cut your template out of fabric and you sew your template and you sew it 1 centimetre in from the edge, it won't be too small because you've already added the extra centimetre all the way around to your template. So it will actually be the right size, the size you wanted it to be in the first place, okay? So you need to add a 1 centimetre seam allowance to your feature if you're sewing 2 pieces together. Now you only need to do that if you're sewing two pieces together, so you only need to do it for double features like ears, horns, etc. You draw the 1 centimetre seam allowance around your template. You don't need to do this for the things like patches and dots that you're sewing on at the end when your hat is made. You can make your template the actual size and you don't have to add a seam allowance to it because you're sewing those on top. You're not sewing it together with something else and you're not making it smaller.